All right. I have a question for almost everybody, so I'll just put it all out there and you guys can answer them in whatever order. Dwayne, you gave a comparison of Exxon Valdez to Deepwater Horizon, but were there any contrasts, anything that's notable differences between the two communities that just jumps out at you? Then, cognitive social capital. Would you equate that to topophilia? That's kind of, yeah, I love that. I try and get that word into every time I speak. It's love of place, love of community. It almost sounds like that was the direction you're taking cognitive social capital, a term I've never heard before. Next is, they're in Louisiana State. Do you know Frederick Leal? At Louisiana State, he's done studies post-Katrina on the Jewish community, and I was wondering if you looked at any of that and compared to the Catholics that you were talking to themselves, parishes. And I'll just do the last.
Yeah. I can't even remember them. So, okay, let's start with Dwayne and we'll go down, and then if we have to repeat questions, we can do that. But that's great. Good note-taking. Okay, all yours.
Okay, so differences between Exxon Valdez and Deepwater Horizon, there's really quite a few, particularly in terms of the complexity of the communities involved, the number of people involved. Cordova was very isolated. Most of the coastal regions of Alaska that were impacted by the Exxon Valdez, relatively sparsely populated, probably a heavier reliance on renewable natural resources in Exxon Valdez. Deepwater Horizon, you had particular communities in South Louisiana that have a combination of connection to renewable natural resources and the extractive industries of oil and gas, so you have those complications figuring in. A lot more governments involved. You got, instead of one state government, you've got 4 or 5 state governments involved, a lot more municipalities. So, yeah, there's lots of differences, and we actually have a publication in Context that looked at BP as the Exxon Valdez rerun that discusses some of those. But in terms of the impacts, some very similar impacts, particularly the common measures that we use in both situations. Immediately after, very comparable impacts in terms of psychosocial. Our initial analysis showed really no statistical difference between Cordova and South Mobile County in the immediate aftermath of the spill.
True. Great. Okay, do you mind repeating the question so people can remember what it was?
I'm actually not familiar with that word, so you asked about topophilia, was that right?
Yes. Your term cognitive social capital sounded to me like you're relating social capital to a love of community or love of place.
Okay, so just to kind of back up a second, social capital is one of these, it's kind of like resilience. It's, you know, a big word that's got a lot of meanings and definitions depending on who you talk to. And moreover, it has evolved from a lot of different disciplines, like from political science and sociology, psychology, borrows, and then we got it in health, you know, so we've kind of inherited this. So there are a lot of different concepts that come from different places. So in terms of love of community, yes, I think that we could go into the nuances of how it's different. You can define cognitive social capital in a lot of different ways. I think love of community is very similar to one of the ways that I used it in terms of a sense of community, but yes, there is a lot of overlap with that.
Remember your question?
Yes, thank you. You remember it?
I do. So the answer is yes and no?
Can you repeat the question?
That was easy.
I'm sorry, I was trying to be brief. And remembering the importance of humor. But to get to the point, I actually am familiar with Leal, although I've never collaborated with him, and I'm aware that he's done some wonderful work with the Jewish community in New Orleans East after Katrina, although I haven't had the pleasure of meeting him. And my sample was predominantly Catholic, which is consistent with the demographics of South Louisiana. And while we measured organized religiosity, there aren't enough non-Catholics to permit sub-aggregated data analysis. So I just kind of collapsed across that variable broadly. So that's why, yes, I am aware of Will's work, and no, I haven't compared notes.
Okay. We'll take 2 more questions from the room, and then we have some online.
I guess my question is mainly to Wayne or anyone who wants to answer it. One of the lessons you pointed out, the first one that you pointed out from the technical school disaster research is that there are contested interpretations of the event. And I think that's really important. I'm surprised that there hasn't been more research done on that, in part because it's a characteristic of what's now called wicked problems. And one of the features of that is that solutions to the problem are defined in part by the problem, the way that people perceive the problem. And if you look, for instance, at the government funding CE, most of our focus on oceanographic, physiological, physical processes, technological or engineering solutions. There's 1 out of the 5 categories that focuses on public health or other community impact. And I love that this is seminar, because there's always been a lot of people interested in this, and we keep coming back to the idea of the connectedness, the capital, economic, there's so many social features of dealing with disaster, dealing with community resilience, and yet it doesn't get as much support as some of the other physical or technological solutions. So think on how to correct that balance.
So is that a question?
You can answer that one. You can put on the spot.
I'm not sure what the question is, but certainly there is a lot of contested interpretations and meanings with technological disasters compared to natural disasters, and a lot of that has to do with the invisible impacts of toxic contamination that's not readily apparent. You know, when the hurricane comes through, you can see damaged buildings, flooded areas. There's really not a lot of contested interpretation of the damage, but when you have an oil spill, are the resources recovered? Maybe, maybe not, depends on who you ask. Or is the seafood contaminated? Maybe it is, maybe it's not, depends on who you ask. So you got lots of competing definitions, and then this goes back to some of the things that Jenny was talking about, is this enhances uncertainty, and it has tremendously negative impact on mental health. When you have this constant uncertainty and you're searching for different meanings, and there's not one meaning that you can really sink your teeth into, like after the Joplin tornado, for example. It doesn't take anybody to contest that there's a problem there, that there was a disaster. So it really fits into the mental health because of the uncertainty and the prolonged uncertainty, because you don't have that closure on what actually happened and what the extent of the damages were.
First off, I'd like to thank you for your presentations. I thought they were wonderful, and I appreciate also your dedication and commitment to this area of research, and you're moving in that direction with your career. So thank you very much. One of the things I'd like to ask each of you is to tell me if community members were part of your research team, and if they actually performed what type of activities as members of your team.
So community members were not actually members of our research team, but we certainly did some pre-survey work. We went in and we talked to various community leaders and stakeholder leaders to get an idea of what the salient issues were in terms of the impact and how the community was responding. So we included those kinds of ideas and input from community members into the design of our study, but they weren't actually involved in collecting the data or interpreting the data or analyzing the data.
So this is a little bit of a touchy question for us, but the WATCH study was funded as part of this research consortium where there was a required component that had to include the community, but then when we got funded, the community portion was cut out entirely. So we actually were unfunded to do that, though we had planned to do it and we still wanted to do it, and we were technically still required to do it. And so we did work with a community liaison and several different community agencies to interact with them and share results, get ideas. And so we did have several points of contact, but in terms of the day-to-day work, that was not actually part of our mission any longer.
Thank you for asking that question. That's excellent. I was very fortunate to have community support. I would never have gained access to the population of study without the help of the Catholic Church. I had a security nun who held my hand and brought me to places I've never been before and opened the door to where I could interact with people who would never otherwise have agreed to participate in research. So I had that door-opening experience, and I also had 2 undergraduate research assistants, both from St. Bernard, one that had moved away, one that was still there, and the one that was still there actually got very interested in the study while we were collecting data and offered to help. So fortunately, I had grant funding and I hired her. So she helped collect data and helped analyze data as well, both in St. Bernard and also the comparison group in Baton Rouge. So I absolutely am a strong advocate for on-the-ground support. In my opinion, it's just essential for project success.
I would say that it really varies depending on the project we're talking about for us. For example, I presented data from the telephone survey, and the telephone survey, we used a lot of the same things that have already been done in Exxon Valdez disaster because we really wanted to be able to do that comparison. And the first paper that came out was with Swain, so it was a side-by-side comparison of these exact same methodology and questions. But if you trace all the way down to the work we're doing right now, we're working inside federally qualified health centers, and we're actually building out increased access to mental and behavioral health care as part of integrated health teams. That's done in complete partnership with the centers we work with, and that partnership, and the input that we get goes from the CEO down to the front desk, and everybody in between, and we do needs surveys. They tell us, if they want specific trainings on mental health. We have done mental health first aid for entire centers because they wanted that. The school system, same way. So, it really ranges from complete involvement of the entity that we're working with to a telephone survey where a polling group did it, and we gave them questions that were already screened. Pretty wide.
And then for our center, we worked with the different, 19 different agencies on the coast of Mississippi. 10 of those were direct services, so people were receiving mental health services at these places. And so what we did was we worked with these different community resources and places where people were receiving services, and we trained those community members about what kind of participants we were wanting to select, because we wanted people who were saying that they were directly impacted by this, the oil spill. And so for our grant, we worked closely with different community organizations and different community people.
And I'll also thank you for that question. I think one of the reasons that we pulled this seminar together was to bring scientists, folks that are working on programs, and people from the community together so we can start kind of getting some more. I mean, everybody does. You guys just said that you do work with the communities, but just trying to see if it's another opportunity to bring people together to kind of strengthen those partnerships. So that's a great question. We have some questions online. If you want to start, Sarah.
I think this came in when Dr. Gill was still speaking. Within the range of social impacts, the macro, the middle, and the micro, of the three, which do you believe is the most important to deal with in order to be resilient?
Good question. I was going to get that online.
Well, I appreciate the question, but I think they're all important. I split those out more as a way of organizing our thoughts, and so I don't really see one as being more important than the other. Now, in terms of programs, there might be things that you could do differently to address each level. You know, the kinds of mental health programs that Jenny and others are working with really focuses a lot on more of the micro individual levels, but if you want to try to enhance resilience at a much broader level, then you're more interested in the macro and the middle range. So I wouldn't necessarily say one is more important than the other. They all need to be addressed simultaneously.
Any other questions in the room? If not, I have a good, I guess, oh, and any other ones online? Nope, okay. If you do have any questions online, submit them, but, so I have a question for each of you, and this is kind of just to pull everything together. I have lots of notes that I'm going to put on these boards later to kind of summarize different highlights from people's talks, but I was wondering if you guys could each, now I was going to use the word trait, and now I'm nervous to use that word, but each talk about one, I'll say trait or characteristic that you think is important for resilient individuals or communities, and maybe also, so not only that characteristic, but also ways that we might improve that characteristic or get, you know, help our communities to be more resilient. Does that make sense? Maybe? Okay. I don't know who wants to go first.
I'll go first.
Okay, again.
And I just lost my train of thought.
Oh, okay.
So you're asking about one particular characteristic of the community that would make them be resilient?
And how we can get the community. So I'm trying to pull everything that you guys talked about together. Maybe this is easier said than done. But just to talk about maybe one thing that, so trait or characteristic that we might try to improve so to help a community be more resilient.
Okay, so obviously based on my talk, I think we know what I would say, which has to do with the social connections in a community would be one of the very important characteristics to make them be resilient. And I think that this is something that needs to be worked on prior to a disaster or really at any point in time. It's not a post-disaster type of intervention where you would suddenly start to, you know, let's build up our social connections. So these are things I think that need to be in place in a community beforehand. And how that would be done, I'm going to have to leave that to the experts on those interventions.
That's perfect, though. What else?
One word?
Oh, as many words as you want. Just remember lunch is next. No, I'm kidding.
I'm a psychologist. I can really only think in terms of the individual, faith, the knowledge of things unseen, and the hope of things to come. That is a construct at the individual level, but I think it can probably be harnessed at the community level in the context of disaster when everything is wrecked and gone, the knowledge of things unseen, rebuilding, recovering, hope of things to come. It will get better, I think would be helpful.
And Katie, is there any ways that you can think of that communities can maybe strengthen that, or things people can do to kind of maybe increase their faith or increase their hope? If not, that's okay. That could be.
That is such a tricky question. Because I stepped on some minefields when I was tiptoeing around that.
But any examples in communities where you saw very communities where faith and hope really helped them recover? Any things that you saw that were really successful maybe?
Well, I wonder if I may pipe in. A lot of people kind of bringing in the meaning in life research, because that's what we do. A lot of people find meaning and make sense of the world through their religious kind of through their religious teachings. And so I'm sure with, what you saw was that for the people who were able to adaptively cope with their religion, it was because they were able to make sense of the disaster by using their religion. But the people who were not adapting as well, who were questioning things, were kind of questioning, wait, what is the meaning of this religious doctrine that I've been following, because it doesn't make sense now in this context. So I wonder if that plays a role in
what she said.
Good.
To me, I think that we need to think about intentional belonging as a strategy. So when we talk about community voices, a lot of times voices are siloed in their own pack. So, or they don't have a voice at all. Marginalized groups often they're not at the table. They do not have a seat at the table. So I think we actually, the happiness research says that we don't like change, and yet change actually makes us happier, right? So we tend to like, everything to be stable and controllable, but if if you're married for, how many are married for a long time? Like if it's stable and controllable for too long, you need a little, you need some difference too. So I think we have strong groups made already. The problem is that they don't actually intersect with each other enough. And so if we think about intentional belonging as how can we make these two groups fuse together a little bit here and there, and I don't know, I mean, I've just been thinking like there must be nodal people, which kind of gets back to your community health workers, nodal people that play in two pretty disparate groups that don't actually play together. I'll just use my son briefly as an example. He's a very good soccer player, and his soccer team at his public high school is mostly an immigrant team, so it mostly has players from Africa. He is also an IB program, which is like the hard academic program. He's the only person who intersects those two venues. And he doesn't usually have friends from this group over when he's having friends from the other groups. He actually, I think intentionally as a high schooler, keeps those two groups sort of distinct, but he's very close to both groups. How can we empower people who will sit at that intersection to actually do what it takes to fuse those groups, right? How can we empower researchers to connect to the right community people to fuse those groups? Who are those people? And can we figure out how to get a handle on that? I don't know. I'm just, giving you random thoughts, but somehow that social connection has to happen.
We have a comment, hold on. Are you referring to the go-between?
Yeah, the go-between, right,
yes.
right.
I often feel I've become such a person.
Yeah.
And I brought two groups together in some work that I'm doing, which is a little related to this. I mean, it's
right.
social, it's environmental, it's connected with Michael Tree Ministry. I have to, the story, I have to put all of the things on the table, whether I like to spend a county or not, and whether they're in my life, how I'm going to go forward, so, like I said, it goes.
How can we find those community go-betweens and support them to weave that community connection web stronger and tighter? Because the stronger and tighter it's weaved together, the more likely it is that that community is going to be resilient no matter what happens. It'll be like a trampoline, right? So when the webs are really tight, you will bounce. If the web's fray.
One more comment. I have to say that my answer is community organizing. That is finding the self-interest of each group, finding something that they're both concerned about, so that you can work with the people and they'll find out that they have something in common.
Mutual interest.
And then they want to work together.
Very good.
Okay, that's a good one. Anyone more? Any questions?
Just a comment. I think it's really intentional about identifying community organizations that have demonstrated their capacity to work across boundaries.
Right.
And those are oftentimes the community organizations that are embedded in the community, been there for a long time, see the web of their connections and therein lies possibilities of bringing different groups together. And one other thing, I think, religion in and of itself, sometimes religious beliefs can bring in competing ideas, competing interpretations. So we have to be willing not just to say it's religion, but some of those interpretations work against health.
Yeah.
Pay attention to that.
Well, and I think that's something with a lot of the different things we've talked about, because I think that you can have certain characteristics that can be helpful, but they can also be maladaptive in certain situations. And so like with social support and religious spiritual coping, it's very important that we're looking at how different individuals or communities are interpreting them or how they're receiving those, because they can be detrimental or very beneficial depending on what's going on with them. And that's an important distinction I think we've all kind of shown or talked about.
Wayne, did you want to add yours?
My thought came back. You had one.
Perfect time.
Really, it comes down, I think, to the social. It's what everybody here, including David, talked about, the importance of social, social capital, social attachment, and that's a very multidimensional concept. With all the resilience initiatives coming down, there's a potential for it to be very top-down oriented, and to really have resilience, you have to have the grassroots organizations, just like you mentioned here, and you need these grassroots organizations working from the bottom up as well as the top-down perspective. I think one other thing is we need to recognize that sometimes traits of strength can also be weakness. Okay, so sometimes our greatest strength is also our greatest weakness. So some of the people I've worked with, particularly in Cordova, they value the traits of independence and being able to go it alone. And that works until you have a need to be with people, and then that can work against you because you're too proud to ask for help. You're too proud to go to the mental health clinic because there's stigma to it. So that very strong trait of individuality, which is important for resilience, can also undermine resilience in a different way.
Great, okay. Is everybody hungry?
Yeah.
I'm hungry. Okay, so we're going to break for lunch. Let's just give our speakers another huge round of applause. You guys did a great job. Okay, and so they're going to be, I think most of them are sticking around for the day, which is awesome. You have also your handout with the agenda and all the panelists, their bios. So those folks are interested. If you want to chat with them, feel free. So lunch is out here. We're going to start back up at 1:30, okay?